Haig Nalbantian is co-founder and co-leader of the Workforce Sciences Institute. A labor and organizational economist, he brings an evidence-based asset management approach to human capital management and developing and applying rigorous empirical methods to quantify and assess the workforce and business impact of human capital factors. Haig spent 25 years as a senior partner at the global consulting firm Mercer, where he originated and helped develop their practice in workforce strategy and analytics. Haig's talk this morning will delve into his most recent research on barriers to the effectiveness of employer DEI strategies and effective ways to overcome them. Welcome, Haig.
What an honor it is to be part of this wonderful summit and to have the opportunity to share some of the learnings about the use of advanced analytics with this audience. I very much appreciate the invitation. You know, when we talk about the application of analytics and the surging use of analytics in the HR domain to inform work and workforce management is very much a part of that future. And what I want to speak to today is how such analytics are already being used, and I'll pay particular attention to their application to issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion. The perspective I bring comes from almost 35 years of working with client organizations, applying advanced analytics to solve workforce issues or problems and to address and develop workforce strategies. The methodology we use, and we'll get into this a little more in the Q&A session, but the methodology is something we call internal labor market analysis, is very much focused on understanding the dynamics of how a workforce is created, who's coming in, how people are moving through an organization and progressing, who's staying and who's leaving, and how organizations value their employees for what they bring and for how they perform. So in doing those models, typically we would analyze the drivers of retention, promotion, performance, and pay. We, of course, account for the role of demographics. And what you will see in what I share is that we learn a lot about both what we call unexplained differences in what happens to people in different demographic groups, meaning even after you account for the multiple factors that influence those outcomes, there may be differences that remain related to race or to gender. As well as, and maybe even more importantly, the explained differences. So certain factors may influence those outcomes. Maybe it's educational attainment, maybe it's the role you're in. And those too can contribute to differential outcomes for different groups. And I want to speak today. I had the opportunity late last year to systematically review multiple internal labor market studies I had done with clients to see what were the more generalizable and if you will, universal patterns in our work. Typically in the human capital domain, there aren't that many universals, surprisingly. Context matters a lot, and what works in one organization may not work in another, or may actually work the other way. But we do find when it comes to DEI and the impact of demographics, there are some strong universals. I'm going to briefly review with you the results of that survey I did of the various outcomes of these ILM studies. And then I want to show you how organizations are and can use the results of advanced analytics to actually proactively intervene to try and create better outcomes. The review is 20 organizations. They are a mix of large and mid-sized companies. They are mostly global. They cover both manufacturing and the service sector. Collectively, about 700,000 employees were covered in this study over multiple years. The typical study was 3 to 5 years. And each analysis involved the modeling of the likelihood of promotion, the likelihood someone gets a high performance rating, the likelihood someone stays or leaves the organization in a given period of time. And pay levels. So first I'm going to talk about the unexplained disparities. And what you can see on this slide is that there are some very consistent patterns. At the top row, you can see what we're finding for women. And there's quite an anomaly here, which is something I've seen in many, many assignments well beyond these 20. You'll say women are actually more likely to be highly rated. In this sample, 80% of the company, in 80% of the companies, women were actually more likely to receive high performance ratings, all else being equal. But you'll also see, if you look to the promotion columns, that in most of the organizations, the majority, they're less likely to be promoted. You know, that's quite a contradiction, but something we see routinely. If you look at people of color, and I've highlighted what happens to Black employees here, the results are really quite stark, significantly less likely to be promoted for Black employees. Not in a single one of these companies were they more likely to be promoted. You see that 0%. And if you look to the right on the ratings, virtually universal, that they're less likely to get high ratings. And there are very few universals, as I say, in the work we do, but this is one of them. I can go from assignment to assignment. Ratings and the inability of Black employees to get even to that normal distribution of ratings is a major, major roadblock to their ability to advance. So this is the unexplained part, and it presents a rather unhappy view of what still goes on. These are mostly elite, large employers. And so one has to wonder if this is what the disparities look like in that part of the economy. What do they look like elsewhere? It raises some major questions. Notwithstanding these unexplained disparities, there are explained differences that are really quite critical. And in my judgment and in my experience, they're actually more important to the ultimate success of diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies than is simply getting rid of those unexplained differences that seem to reflect a bias. And there are 5 that I'm going to call out. I don't have the opportunity, given the time constraints, to give you examples of each of these. I'm going to focus in just on 2 with examples, but let me hit these topics very quickly. The first one we've already talked about, performance ratings. So clearly, in most organizations, there is an orientation to have things driven by performance, and the rating an individual gets in any given year is very predictive of what else will happen to them, whether they'll be promoted, whether they stay with the organization, what their pay level is, and even what their performance rating is likely to be in the future. We find a lot of persistency in performance ratings. So if you have a high performance rating this year, you have a much higher probability to get high ratings. Not only does that have an immediate effect on diminishing promotion probability and pay and retention, but it also suggests they're much more likely to have low performance ratings in the following year. So it becomes almost a blockade. This imbalance cascades through the system and creates real obstacles to career progression. So something our clients pay strong attention to when this finding is uncovered. If they're not able to get to the bottom of this and understand what's going on here that makes this such a pervasive pattern, they're really going to struggle to make anything else work. The second explained difference relates to roles. In organizations, there are some roles that no matter who you are, if you touch them in your career, it increases the likelihood that good things are going to happen to you from a career standpoint. And there are also roles which no matter who you are, if you touch them in your career, they're likely to depress the trajectory of your career progress. The challenge here is that all too often we find that women and people of color are less likely to be in those so-called accelerator roles. And I'll give you a sample. A very a generic role is supervisory positions. We will find almost universally in our modeling that if you're a supervisor, if other people report to you, all else being equal, you're more likely to be promoted, you're more likely to get high ratings, you're more likely to be paid more. Most organizations value their supervisors. But you'll see that women and people of color are less likely to be in supervisor roles. And for women, very often, even if they get to supervisor positions, it's later in their career relative to comparable men. And so they don't get the full benefit of that lift to their career trajectory in the way that their male counterparts do. So it can be quite damaging to long-term equity for women in the organization. Reporting relationships also matter a lot. So who you report to matters. And we find in particular that all else equal, if you report to a high-performing supervisor, a supervisor who has high ratings in the scale of each organization, you're more likely yourself to get highly rated and you're more likely to be promoted. Similarly, if you are reporting to someone who is higher up in the hierarchy than the typical reporting relationship, you're also likely to benefit enormously. Now, when I put the demographic lens on this, it's less consistent. So I won't tell you women are always less likely to be reporting up or be reporting to top performing supervisors, or similarly for people of color. But we do often see that. And when we see that, you realize, again, there is this systemic impediment to their ability to advance. So keeping your eye on reporting relationships is very critical to being able to do this. Internal mobility. So many organizations build their leadership development systems and programs on the basis of mobility. The idea being, and a very reasonable idea being, that good leaders have breadth of experience, that the more they know about the organization, working in different geographies, in different parts of the business, with different sets of employees and different sets of customers, that builds breadth, that tests their ability to perform. So if people are performing well in changing circumstances, maybe they have inherently better leadership capability. All of those are reasonable assessments, and you can understand why you might build a leadership development platform on mobility. However, we all know that at certain points in their lives, women may be less mobile. They still disproportionately bear caregiver status and child rearing and the likes may impair their ability to move on. So having a counterpart, being able to do things other than physically move, may be really important for organizations if they want to ensure women are getting into leadership positions. So this can become a systemic block to the ability of women to succeed. And the final one, which is really more and more important in our post-COVID world, flexible work arrangements. Everyone is talking about them these days. We've seen how they performed during COVID, and generally speaking, the verdict is pretty positive. The productivity didn't wane too much with remote working, and that people being able to determine more how they work and where they work is beneficial. But the red flag here is that historically, flexible work arrangements have been career killers for whoever takes them. Being on part-time status associated with reductions in promotion probability, ratings, retention, and the like, remote work, similarly, any kind of leave, similar kind of status. So we've seen this in organizations. The question is, has COVID changed that? Or will we see a reversion to that norm, so to speak, as COVID, the impact of COVID wanes? Something to be very much alert to, given how universal that negative impact has been, at least historically. So I want to give a few examples here. This one will focus on roles and supervisor. This is a large insurance organization, a global company. And what I've done on this slide is simply focus on the situational factors. So we're controlling for all the other individual factors, like a person's tenure, their educational level, the location they're in, et cetera. But here we're looking at roles, supervisor attributes, and the attributes of team members. And you can see here that there's a lot of green associated with the supervisor relationship. So, if you are in a supervisor role or a client-facing role, you see those greens, more likely to get high ratings, much, much more likely to be promoted. If you are reporting to a higher level supervisor and a highly rated supervisor, you can see the green there under ratings and promotion probability. So those are all good things, which align with what I've just said. The question becomes, are women and people of color likely to be in those situations? Are they in those roles? Are they reporting to those kinds of supervisors? And our findings here were virtually across the board, women and people of color were less likely to be in those advantageous positions. And the one other thing I'll point out on this slide, you can see under team size, there's a big red there on promotion probability. Bottom line here, in this organization, if you were part of a small team, all else being equal, you're much less 89% less likely to be promoted. Black employees in particular were much more likely to be in small teams. So the point here is there are these situational factors that in this organization thoroughly explain the outcomes, but are nonetheless working to the detriment of women and people of color, which provides a very tangible focal point for action. And very conscious of time, with part-time and remote working here, you can see all the red across the board on part-time employment and some red relating to being out on leave. In this organization, it really hurt you. This is another insurance company. It really hurt you to be on any kind of flexible working arrangement. So what do you do about this? There's something we call proactive career management that is an approach that takes the learnings from this kind of modeling and uses them to better support career development for employees an organization wishes to nurture and have remain with them. So if you want people to stay and thrive, you kind of put this situational scan on your workforce and examine to what extent your diverse employees and employees you really think represent your future are being positioned to succeed. And so what you see on this page, this is from a large retail consumer products company. The two columns here, we have the top, I believe it's a dozen predictors of success with respect to promotion. And on the quantity side, that you see a Q column. We're talking about an internal labor market, so there are quantities and prices. You see a lot of down arrows there. What does that mean? With respect to gender, this is saying that for many of those success predictors, those success factors, if you will, women are less likely to be in those positions, right? So in this company, being an expat was really important. Well, women are less likely to be expats. The P column, the price, reflects how those characteristics are valued for women as compared to men. And you'll see here, for the most part, there are dotted lines there. It means no statistical difference. So if a woman is an expat, she's as likely as her male counterpart to benefit from that as the male counterpart. On the other hand, you look at supervisor role, you see two downward arrows. So women are less likely to be supervisors in this company. And guess what? Even when they do become supervisors, it doesn't benefit their careers in the same way, to the same degree, as it does their male counterparts. So you think of this as kind of a success profile where you're putting the demographic lens on it and you're saying, is the success profile for women the same as that of men, for people of color the same as that of whites? And are the attributes that make for success valued in the same way for both, for all demographic groups? And the way this can be implemented is with a simple checklist. There are really two ways. You can give managers and supervisors this checklist and say, be alert to these things. And ask yourself the question, are you positioning your up-and-coming women, your up-and-coming people of color to succeed in the organization in the same way as you are your white colleagues? This makes it very tangible because you know what those green lights are, the things that are favorable to advancement are, and you know the red flags, the things that inhibit advancement. And you just want to make sure that the talent you really want to keep and grow are not being systematically put in disadvantageous positions. So I know we're close to the end of time here. I'm going to stop. Key takeaways here are, talent and drive are very important in shaping careers, of course. The situational factors we find in our analytical work, those situational factors removed from the individual have profound, often inordinate effects on what happens to employees. And all too often, women, people of color simply aren't being positioned to succeed in the same way as their white male counterparts. So it's not the same as unexplained disparities. It's simply that the avenues to success in the organization are not as open to them. The good news is, in the age of analytics, we're in a position, most organizations, smaller ones perhaps less, but we're in a position to empirically evaluate what those success drivers are and how situational factors influence the outcomes. And we can therefore try to level the playing field in a very tangible way using proactive career management, actually monitoring and helping ensure that employees understand what are the avenues to success and are getting those opportunities is really important.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Haig. And we covered a lot of material in 20 minutes there, so I'm happy to report that Haig has an article in the upcoming summer issue of MIT Sloan Management Review that goes into a great deal more depth on the work that he's done. And we have had a lot of questions for you. So I'm going to dive right into some audience questions here. A number of more broader, and then some really specific questions digging into your research. Especially as we've seen a lot of interest in the questions on the work from home and flexible work. Why would the impact of flexible work be different for women versus men post-COVID? Asks this member of our audience. Is it because more men thought flexible work during COVID, so women were no longer making choices that differed from the white male full-time norm? And if that's so, should organizations consider incentives to encourage more employees to adopt flexible work options?
Well, that's a really interesting question, a profound one. I can say that with respect to leaves of absence, we do tend to find, say, in European organizations, where men are almost as likely as women to go out on leave, and they're encouraged to take family leave when a child is born, that the differential impact is less. So we think part of the reality is that the uptake has been historically more women choosing to take these positions, and the systemic effects therefore affect them adversely. So to the extent we in HR are monitoring the distribution of utilization, if you will, of these arrangements and ensuring that it's not vastly disproportional for one group or another, I think you're less likely to have these adverse effects. Absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you. And the word of the day is AI, at least of the month here. And so somebody asked, Do you think the upcoming AI transformation of companies will add to the discrimination and bias experienced by women and people of color? That is, the first ones to be fired would be, people who are already in more rote jobs, for example.
Well, I know, the greatest experience we have with this is on the recruiting side. There was an explosion over the last decade of different recruiters using predictive hiring methods, applying AI, right? So they kind of match you to the success profile. And there are very big risks there because the way the evaluations are made, they're not unbiased, right? There are baked in differences in people using technologies. For example, older workers may have less versatility and be less able to navigate the technologies that are used for these purposes. So they're systematically blocked out, similarly with people of color. So I definitely do have concerns. There's no question there are advantages to such tools if you have high volume, but we need to bake in protections. And one of the ways you can do it is by understanding your success profiles, right? Because you don't want to map something to a structure that is already biased. If you're driving your hiring based on your success profile, and your success profile is working to the disadvantage of certain groups, you need to repair that problem first before you start to reinforce it with hiring that will bring in, will aggravate those differentials.
And we had a number of questions all around I think the disparities in performance ratings.
Yeah.
And the question was, did you also look at the gender and race of the manager performing the evaluation?
Absolutely. So in all of these models, when we account for supervisor characteristics, we will account for all of their demographics, and we'll look at the matching. This may be surprising, but we see less consistent patterns there. So I can't tell you if it's a white supervisor evaluating a black employee that is always or even preponderantly associated with negative outcomes. Similarly with gender, it sometimes happens, but it sometimes happens in the reverse. We'll sometimes find black supervisors are less likely to give a black employee a high performance rating. So I wouldn't necessarily assume that race and gender are driving those outcomes, but positioning and the performance of the supervisor, him or herself, very much so.
Now, a question about your process, your methodology, especially when working with individual companies. How much data, how many years of data is needed to really understand what's going on in the labor market of a company?
Longitudinal data is really critical here. Yeah. I almost never use a point in time data and do cross-sectional analyses, because so much of what matters in human capital takes place over time. And if you ever want to get to causal relationships, or at least intimate that you've captured a causal relationship, you need multiple points in time. 3 years is kind of a minimum to really get a picture of what's happening from a career standpoint. 5 years, even better. We actually don't like to go much beyond, unless you were looking at long-term career trajectories in a very focused study on careers. You might want to go longer than that. But, the world is changing so rapidly. Organizations are changing. You don't want to let ancient history dominate the results you get. So 3 to 5 years is a good window. 600, 700 employees in a group is kind of a threshold that we need. But obviously there's a trade-off there. So the more years, the more observations, the fewer employees you need. But I'd kind of say 500, 600 plus 3 to 5 years is a threshold.
Okay, great. And we just have about less than half a minute left. So I will just, there have been a few questions asking about, gather that this data is US based. I'm wondering if you've done any similar analyses in other countries, especially Europe.
Oh yeah, no, this is, I think only 40% of the employees in the 20 companies that I reviewed for this for the study were U.S. based. These are global organizations for the most part, and we find patterns are these kind of patterns are quite similar. Wherever we are, tend to be more Europe and Asia and the U.S. Haven't done as much in Latin America, so I don't want to speak to that.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. And that is all we have time for. Really appreciate this getting us started today, Haig, with a really fantastic session, and congratulations on the research you've done. It's really powerful to be able to see this and have it based on a really rigorous data analysis. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth.